The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like something mechanical dying slowly. Danielle Ross stood in the break room doorway of Oak Creek Memorial at 11:48 p.m., still wearing her fresh white nursing clogs that hadn't yet learned to move silently across tile, and watched Dr. Hargrove arrange the entire ER staff in a loose semicircle around him. 23 people. She counted without meaning to, a habit from her other life, the one that ended when she chose to disappear into this San Diego hospital 3 months ago. The antiseptic smell hung thicker at night, mixing with stale coffee from the pot that had been brewing since the day shift left. Cold stainless steel gleamed from the refrigerator behind Hargrove's left shoulder. He stood with the casual authority of a man who had never once questioned whether the room belonged to him. "The new girl won't last a week," Hargrove announced, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being believed. He smiled, the kind of smile that made other people uncomfortable without understanding why. "In fact, I'll put money on it. $100 says she folds. Breaks down. Quits." 2 residents laughed. A trauma nurse named Chen didn't. The attending physician from the day shift, a woman named Morrison who had shown Danielle how to organize the suture kits on her first shift, looked away toward the window. Danielle stood perfectly still. One measured breath. The kind of breath she'd learned in places where breathing wrong could kill you. Her hands, scarred across the knuckles from a remedy incident she would never discuss, hung loose at her sides. She wore a trauma shears on a beaded lanyard around her neck, a gift from her son before his last deployment, engraved on the handle with initials she'd never explained to anyone at Oak Creek. The other nurses thought it was just a tool. It was a tether. A proof that another version of her still existed somewhere, even if she'd spent 3 months teaching herself to forget it. "You feeling okay, new girl?" Hargrove turned to face her directly. His smile widened. "You look pale." "I'm fine, doctor." Her voice came out smaller than it should have, which was intentional. Controlled. Quiet dignity wasn't about accepting insults, it was about choosing not to give them the weight they demanded. "You sure about that?" He turned back to his audience. "Because I've seen residents with more spine than that. We'll see how you handle yourself when the real traumas roll in. When things get loud. When there's actual pressure." He paused for effect, like he'd practiced it. "My money's good. Anyone want to cover it?" No one spoke up. In hospitals, betting against the new person felt safer than betting for them. Danielle left before anyone else did, moving through the staff room and into the main ER corridor where the rail work happened. The night shift hummed with controlled urgency, monitors beeping in staggered rhythm, the ventilator in Bay 3 producing its mechanical wheeze, the wheels of the crash cart waiting like a sleeping predator beneath the wall phone. The ER at Oak Creek had 17 beds arranged in a horseshoe pattern, trauma bays along the outer wall, the central station in the middle where the attending physicians and charge nurse coordinated the choreography of emergency medicine. It was smaller than the trauma centers she remembered from before, quieter in the way that made her shoulders tense. She preferred quiet now. Quiet meant nothing was dying. She'd been hired 2 months and 31 days ago by the nurse manager, Patricia Vance, who had asked exactly 3 questions during the interview. "Where are you from? Why nursing? Can you start nights?" Danielle had answered honestly without answering at all. "San Diego. Because I know how to keep people alive." "Yes." Patricia had hired her on the spot, which meant she was either desperate or she didn't check references carefully. Danielle suspected both. The first 3 months had been the longest silence of her life. No one knew who she was. No one asked. She arrived for her shifts, she moved through the corridors, she did the work that still came to her hands like muscle memory, drawing blood with the first stick, catching sepsis before it announced itself, knowing when a patient's breathing pattern meant something the monitors hadn't registered yet. She was invisible. She had wanted to be invisible. The ER during the 12:36 a.m. hours was the threshold between evening chaos and the deep night shift's particular darkness. The waiting room still held 8 people, a construction worker with a possible fracture, an elderly woman with chest pain, teenagers with a friend who'd taken too many pills, families who had decided the ER was their best option at midnight. Danielle moved through the space without the bustle of the day nurses. She checked her assignment from the charge nurse, a rotation man named Garrett, who nodded at her once and returned to his paperwork. "Ross, you're taking bays 2, 4, and 6. Bay 4's got a 91-year-old with possible UTI and delirium. Bay 2 just got a laceration that needs cleaning. Bay 6 empty, but we're holding it for incoming." She nodded. "How incoming?" "Helicopter." Garrett didn't look up. "Military transport. ETA 26 minutes. They radioed ahead about trauma, critical injuries, coming out of Baghdad. Navy's handling the transfer through Balboa. We're diverting everything else to Sharp Memorial until this patient stabilized and sorted." The information settled into her like a stone in still water. Baghdad. Military transport. Those words had no longer belonged to her world. She had walked away from that world intentionally, signed the paperwork that made her disappearance official, chosen this hospital in this city specifically because it was far enough from any base that the old life wouldn't drift back toward her. "Understood," she said. "I'm ready." Garrett glanced up. "You've never worked a critical military transfer." "I'll manage," Danielle said. It wasn't quite a lie. She moved toward Bay 2, where a man with a 2-inch laceration across his palm lay on the gurney looking embarrassed about the way blood had patterned his work shirt. She gathered the suture kit, for .0 absorbable, Vicryl, the needle holder already in her hands before her conscious mind caught up with the muscle memory. She could feel the weight of the trauma shears at her neck, the engraved initials pressing against her collarbone like a question she'd been avoiding for 93 days. The helicopter was already in the air somewhere over the Pacific. She didn't need to be told who it was carrying. In this moment, in this break room 3 months after she'd chosen silence, the old world was flying toward her at 180 miles per hour. The break room fell silent when Dr. Hargrove walked in at 1:11 p.m., still wearing his white coat like armor, still carrying the weight of a $100 bill he'd wagered 3 months ago. Danielle was microwaving leftover rice, her back to the door, and she heard his footsteps before she heard his voice. "Everyone gather around," he said, loud enough that 2 nurses from the hallway turned to look. "I want to introduce you all to a little experiment in work ethic." She didn't turn. She waited. "Our new girl here," he continued, and Danielle felt every eye in the room shift to her, "has been here exactly 93 days. I gave her a week. Anyone want to revise their bets?" A few nervous laughs scattered across the break room like dropped marbles. Someone snorted. Hargrove smiled the way a shark smiles, all teeth and no warmth. "I'm feeling generous. I'm raising it to $200 she doesn't make it through shift change Friday." Danielle turned slowly, her rice forgotten. She looked at him with the calm of someone who'd already survived worse than his contempt. She met his eyes without flinching, without the tremor that weak people gave him. Just a measured breath. Just the weight of her own certainty. "Sweetheart," he said, moving closer, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension reserved for children and servants, "you're in over your head. Everyone can see it. Why not save yourself the embarrassment?" She didn't answer. She just turned back to her rice. But the real humiliation came that afternoon. Danielle was walking through the cafeteria at 2:13 p.m., her tray balanced on her palm, sandwich, salad, a bottle of water, when she saw him standing by the beverage station. He watched her approach. He watched with the patience of a predator. And when she was exactly 3 feet away, he reached out and knocked the tray sideways with the back of his hand. The sound came first, the sharp crack of the plate hitting tile, the scatter of plastic and food spreading across the floor in a constellation of chaos. The salad slid. The sandwich broke apart. The water bottle rolled under a table, still spinning. Danielle stood motionless for a half-second, watching the mess. Around them, 2 other nurses had frozen mid-conversation. A cafeteria worker looked up from the register. Everyone was watching to see what the new girl would do. Hargrove bent down slowly and picked up the patient chart he'd left on the nearest table, the one he'd been holding the whole time. He held it by one corner and let it drop at her feet like it was contaminated, like she was contaminated. The pages scattered across the tile, mixing with the fragments of her lunch. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice smooth as oil, his smile wide and deliberate. "Looks like this one's within your skill set." The moment stretched. Danielle could feel the weight of attention, the pressure of humiliation, the kind designed to break people, to make them cry in public bathrooms, to send them home and tell their families they couldn't hack it. She could feel the machinery of it all, the public stage, the witnesses, the deliberate cruelty meant to echo through every conversation that would happen in this hospital for the next week. One measured breath. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, just one tear, just enough to acknowledge she was human, just enough to keep them from seeing the steel underneath. Then she looked at Hargrove with a clarity that made him take half a step back, and she said quietly, "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, Doctor." Her voice didn't shake. Her eye contact didn't waver. She just knelt down, began gathering the pages of the patient chart with methodical precision, and picked up every piece of her scattered lunch without another word. When she stood up, Hargrove was already walking away. But his jaw was tight. His breathing had changed. She'd done something he hadn't expected. She'd absorbed his cruelty without breaking, without crying properly, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her reduced to shame. What he didn't understand was that Danielle had already survived things that would have destroyed him. That night, after his shift, Hargrove sat alone in his office on the third floor with the door locked and the lights off except for the glow of his computer screen. The insurance fraud he'd been running for 7 years was elegant, almost invisible, inflated equipment billing on cardiac monitors he'd bought wholesale for $3,200 but billed to Medicare and private insurers at $14,700 each. Over time, it had added up to nearly $847,000 in fraudulent claims spread across 147 invoices buried in the ICU records. It was perfect. Undetectable. Except for one problem, Danielle Ross. He pulled up her charting logs from the past 3 months and scanned through them with growing dread. She documented everything. Not just her own care, she cross-referenced equipment purchases against actual patient use. She flagged discrepancies. She asked questions in those soft, deferential notes of hers, the kind that seemed innocent on their own but, when compiled across dozens of cases, began to paint a picture of fraud. On Tuesday, she'd noticed that a cardiac monitor listed as used in the ICU had been billed to a patient in recovery. On Thursday, she'd noted that a ventilator purchase order showed a price that didn't match any vendor quote she could find. On Saturday, she'd actually attached a note to the department head asking about the bulk pricing discrepancies on level 1 rapid infusers. She was going to find it. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but soon. And when she did, everything would collapse. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, listening to the fluorescent lights buzz overhead like insects. He had leverage, the hospital board owed him favors, the chief of surgery was his former golf partner, and he had connections to outside auditors who could be influenced. He could protect himself. But he needed her gone first. He needed her off the ICU rotation, out of the records, unable to see the patterns. Starting tomorrow, he would begin documenting every small mistake she made. He would follow her work with the kind of scrutiny he never applied to anyone else. He would call in favors, activate networks, and build a case so airtight that when the time came, and it would come soon, her termination would look legitimate. She'd made a mistake when she responded to his humiliation with that quiet dignity. She'd made a mistake when she didn't cry properly, didn't beg for mercy, didn't give him the psychological victory he'd been counting on. Because now he knew she was a threat not just to his fraud, but to his control. And control was everything. Hargrove opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small notebook. At the top of a fresh page, he wrote, Danielle Ross, documentation log. Below it, he added the date, 3 months in, and already the threat level had escalated beyond insubordination to something far more dangerous. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know where she'd come from or why her hands moved with the kind of precision that belonged on a trauma surgeon, not an ICU nurse. He didn't know about the combat boots in her locker, or the way she moved through the hospital like she was reading terrain, assessing threats, mapping exits. But he was about to find out. And that was the moment everything changed. The intercom crackled at 2:24 a.m. Code Blue. Trauma Bay 4. Medevac inbound from Baghdad with a Priority 1 critical, tension pneumothorax, catastrophic hemorrhage, ETA 4 minutes. The ER erupted. Nurses moved to stations like a practiced orchestra, each knowing their part. Danielle didn't look up from her charting. 3 months at Oak Creek Memorial. 3 months of learning the rhythm, the choreography, the way each person's role fit into the machinery of saving lives. She logged out, stood, and walked toward the bay. The rotor wash rattled the windows before the helicopter even landed. She felt it in her sternum, not fear, but recognition. That sound meant a warrior was coming home broken. The stretcher arrived in a blur of motion, 2 Navy corpsmen moving with the precision of people who had done this in far worse conditions than a fully equipped hospital. Lieutenant Commander Pierce. 34 years old. 6'2". Built like someone who had spent a decade carrying weapons and impossible decisions. Danielle's hands went still. She knew that face. Not from television or briefings, but from a phone call 3 months ago, voice crackling over a satellite line. This is Commander Pierce. Your son's unit took fire near Sanjin. He's safe. Everyone under my command came home today. Those words had meant something. They had meant her boy was coming back to her. And this man in Bay 4 with his chest caved in and blood pooling on the stretcher, was the reason she had slept that night without her hands shaking. The corpsmen transferred him in 4 seconds. 15 staff members converged. Danielle positioned herself at his left side, hand steady, already reading the monitors. Blood pressure 68/42. Oxygen saturation 61. Heart rate 156 and climbing. The left lung was collapsed. She could hear the wheeze, the diminished breath sounds on the trauma side. The needle decompression would need to happen fast, or his heart would stop. Dr. Hargrove arrived first. Then Dr. Chen from cardiology. Then Dr. Morrison, the chief of trauma surgery. They were followed by surgeons from 3 other departments, a cardiologist, an orthopedic specialist, 2 intensivists. 12 physicians in total. Danielle counted them automatically. 12 sets of eyes. 12 people whose job was to decide whether this man lived or died. The chest X-ray came up on the monitor. Hargrove leaned in, studying the image. His expression didn't change. Massive bilateral pneumothorax. Pulmonary contusion. Hemorrhagic shock. He straightened. Turned to the trauma team. Time of arrival. 2:51 a.m., someone answered. Blood loss. Estimated 2 liters. Transfusion in progress. Hargrove was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. Not viable. The internal injuries are too extensive. We'd be prolonging suffering. He looked at Morrison. You concur? Morrison studied the images. Nodded. The retroperitoneal bleed alone. The damage pattern suggests multiple organ failure. Hours of surgery. No meaningful outcome. He turned to the team. Let's redirect resources to Bay 2. The construction accident patient has a survivable profile. The cardiologist didn't even examine Pierce. Neither did the orthopedic surgeon. They followed Hargrove's assessment like it was gospel. Within 40 minutes, each of the 12 physicians passed through the bay, looked at the monitors, glanced at the imaging, and made the same decision. Not viable. Not worth saving. Redirect resources. They walked away. One by one, they left. Until only Danielle remained. The monitor beeped its lonely rhythm. Pierce's oxygen saturation had dropped to 58. His blood pressure was barely registering. The left lung was collapsed completely now. Any second, his heart was going to perfuse less blood to his brain. Any second, he would arrest. She didn't look at the other staff members. She didn't ask permission. She didn't hesitate. Danielle moved to the supply tray. Her hands selected what they needed without her thinking. The equipment muscle memory had stored during 12 years of Navy corpsman training, during 3 tours as a combat medic, during a deployment in Ramadi that had left her with more scars than skin in some places. The 14-gauge angiocath needle felt familiar in her fingers. She palpated Pierce's ribs. Located the second intercostal space. The midclavicular line. Her fingers marked the spot the way they had marked anatomy on 100 soldiers before. She didn't breathe. Neither did the room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like something wounded. She felt every eye turn toward her. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping sounded like a confession. The monitor shifted immediately. O2 saturation, 62. Then 68. Then 75. She adjusted the oxygen flow. 82, 88. 92, stable. The monitor found a rhythm. The blood pressure numbers climbed, 84/48. 91/52. The trembling she felt in her hands wasn't fear. It was restraint. The absolute iron grip she had on herself to keep the past from becoming the present. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside. A nurse, Garcia, the charge nurse from the evening shift who had stayed late, stared at her. Then at the monitor. Then back at her. The same thing Dr. Chen had done when she asked about the triage protocol instead of priority system. The same thing Morrison's eyes had done when she mentioned field assessment instead of her initial evaluation. Danielle didn't flinch. She didn't break her focus. She moved the needle slightly, releasing more pressure, watching the numbers stabilize further. 96, holding. She taped it down with movements that looked casual but weren't. Every motion was precision. Every gesture was tactical. "What the hell did you just do?" Garcia whispered. Danielle didn't answer. She was already running through the next steps. Bilateral chest tubes. Massive transfusion protocol. CT to identify the bleeding source. This man needed surgery, real surgery, not the kind 12 doctors had refused to consider. This man needed someone who understood that viable wasn't about percentages on paper. It was about whether you were willing to fight. The room filled suddenly with activity again. Different activity. Someone had called back the surgical team. Someone had flagged the case as critical intervention. The shift had changed. The moment before and the moment after. Before, a Navy SEAL had been written off. After, he was getting a chance. Danielle stepped back from the stretcher. Let the professionals do what professionals did. She was just a nurse. Just a woman with a charting habit and a quiet way of moving through the world. But that wasn't what anyone was looking at her like anymore. Garcia's eyes had moved to her hands. To the calluses across her palms. To the thin white line of scar tissue running from her wrist to her elbow. To the way she had moved, not like someone trained in a hospital, but like someone trained in places where the hospital came to you. She turned away before anyone could ask. Before anyone could notice the way her shoulders had straightened. The way her voice, when she called out vitals, had dropped an octave. The way Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had briefly surfaced, before she could pull the nurse back down again. Behind her, 12 feet away, Dr. Hargrove stood watching from the doorway. The needle was already moving before the last doctor cleared the doorway. 14-gauge angiocath. Danielle's fingers found the space between Pierce's ribs, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the same anatomy she had drilled into her muscle memory across 3 continents and 2 decades. The skin was slick with sweat and blood. Her hand did not shake. She felt for the rib, found the intercostal membrane, and pressed. The needle slid through with barely a whisper of resistance. 2 centimeters. 3. There. The hiss came next, that sound of trapped air escaping under pressure, the sound of a lung re-inflating, the sound of a man not dying. The monitor responded before Pierce's body could. The rhythm climbing from chaos back toward something human. 62 beats per minute. 70. The blood pressure creeping up from the floorboards where it had been collapsing. His color already shifting from the grey-white of exsanguination toward something that resembled life again. The O2 saturation climbing, 68, now 74, now 82. His chest rising with actual breath instead of the drowning gasps of a man whose lung had folded in on itself. She held the needle steady. Kept her hand motionless. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the specific exhaustion of someone who had done this in worse conditions than a fully equipped trauma bay, done it in the dark with mortar fire walking closer, done it in a sandstorm where you could not see your own hands, done it with a tourniquet between her teeth because both her hands were needed somewhere else. This was clean. This was bright. This was almost easy. Sinus rhythm, she said quietly. The room went dead silent. She did not look up. She did not acknowledge the weight of 12 pairs of eyes that had written this man off, that had decided his case was futile, that had moved to the next salvageable patient the way surgeons are trained to do when the math stops working. She kept her attention on the needle, on the chest rising with real oxygen, on the numbers on the monitor that were now building toward survival instead of collapse. And then a hand gripped her wrist. Pierce's hand. His eyes were open. Not focused, not conscious in any traditional sense, but something behind those pupils had registered her presence. His fingers tightened, a reflex, a grip that carried a question or a recognition or something she could not quite name. His lips moved. A sound that was not a word. A name that came out broken and doubled and desperate with the kind of reaching that only someone who has survived combat and been left in the dark can manage. Senior Chief, he whispered. Senior Chief, is that? She pulled her wrist away. Not roughly. Gently. But the pull was complete and the message was absolute. Wrong patient, she said. I'm just a nurse. The cardiac monitor kept climbing. O2 sat climbing. The numbers no longer lying. The evidence of her hand still moving across his skin, adjusting the needle 1 millimeter, 1 degree, 1 breath. She did not turn. Did not look toward the doorway. Did not acknowledge the man standing there with his face draining of color as he watched something impossible happen. Dr. Hargrove had understood, though. She could feel it in the way the air pressure changed when he left the room. He had recognized the precision of her movements. He had seen the way her hands had moved without hesitation into anatomy that should have required a moment of calculation, and he understood what that precision meant. He understood that she was not a nurse who had learned nursing from textbooks. He understood that whatever had brought her to Oak Creek Memorial 3 months ago, it was not what she had claimed. And he understood that a woman like that, a woman with that kind of hands, that kind of knowledge, that kind of calm in a crisis, could notice things. Could see patterns in billing records. Could ask the kinds of questions that surgeons do not ask but nurses sometimes do, nurses who spend 18-hour shifts watching every detail, documenting every medication, tracking every supply. A woman like that could unravel 7 years of inflated equipment invoices and phantom procedures. A woman like that was a threat that could not be allowed to continue. Hargrove made his first call from the stairwell at 11:51 p.m. Chief of Staff, answering his home phone on the third ring, already braced for bad news because that is what calls at 11:27 p.m. always carried. "We have a staffing issue," Hargrove said. His voice was crisp, professional, devoid of the fury that Danielle had glimpsed in the moment before he understood. "The new night shift nurse. I need her badge pulled by morning." The Chief of Staff, a man named Caldwell, 63 years old, with a daughter at Stanford and a mortgage that required board bonuses to maintain, heard the tone and understood what it meant. Hargrove was not asking. Hargrove was instructing. And Hargrove was owed 6 years of referrals, 5 orthopedic surgeons who sent their post-op cases to Hargrove's preferred PT clinic, which paid kickbacks directly to a shell company that Caldwell did not know about but certainly benefited from. On what grounds? Caldwell asked. Medication discrepancies. We'll have HR investigate. The second call came at 11:59 p.m., when the board member named Sterling, wealthy enough that his name belonged on buildings, powerful enough that his phone never actually rang during business hours unless something had already gone wrong, was asleep. Hargrove's message reached him through the intercom. I need your support removing an employee. This person is a liability. Sterling, who had received 3 lucrative vendor referrals through Hargrove's network, who had built his consulting firm on contracts that Hargrove had steered his way, who understood that relationships like this required reciprocity, was already sitting up in bed before the message finished playing. By 6:13 a.m., when Danielle finished documenting Pierce's procedure and began the final notes of her shift, the decision had already been made through channels that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the intricate web of favors that held Oak Creek Memorial together. The HR director arrived at 6:41 a.m. with a folder that was far too thick for a new employee file. She brought a security guard, the same man who had helped Danielle carry boxes to her locker on her first day, who had smiled at her, who had seemed almost kind. She brought Dr. Hargrove, who kept his distance and let others do the talking, a tactic that had served him well for 7 years. We need to speak with you privately, the HR director said. She was not angry. She was the kind of calm that comes from following a script, from removing herself from the actual human cost of the decision. Allegations have been raised regarding medication discrepancies and credential falsification. Danielle stood in the hallway outside the supply room. The night shift had ended. The day shift was beginning. Every eye in Bay 4 could see her from their positions, could see the HR folder, could see the security guard, could read the narrative that was being written in real time about who she was. She did not protest. Did not ask questions. Did not demand to see the specific allegations because she already understood that the specifics did not matter. What mattered was that Hargrove had activated his network and his network had responded with the efficiency of a system designed to protect itself. Your badge, the HR director said. Danielle removed it. The plastic was still cool from her pocket, still warm from the work of saving a life. She held it out. The security guard took it, and something in his face seemed to break a little, a small betrayal that crossed his features and then vanished. A formal investigation will determine next steps, the director said. Including potential criminal charges. The words landed without impact. Danielle had already begun the process of leaving, had already shifted something internal into the compartment where she kept the parts of herself that were not allowed to feel this. She was a nurse who had gotten caught doing something a nurse should not do. Or she was something else entirely, someone who had pretended to be a nurse and whose pretense had collapsed under the weight of muscle memory. She cleared her locker. The scrubs went into her bag. The name badge was gone. She found the pair of worn combat boots at the bottom, the one she had carried for 13 years, the ones that had been wrapped in 3 protective bags because they were the only thing she owned that could not be replaced. The rubber was cracked. The laces were frayed. The boots themselves were soft with age and use, broken in across terrain that the soles could still map if asked. She held them for a moment. Just held them. The weight of them in her hands like an answer to a question she had stopped asking. The rain started as she turned out of the hospital parking lot, a cold rain that came without warning and hit the windshield like a judgment. It was 7:34 a.m. on a Wednesday morning in San Diego, and Danielle Ross was unemployed, under investigation, and driving toward the only place in the city that had ever felt like coming home. Greenstone Memorial Cemetery sat on a hillside overlooking the eastern edge of the city. She knew this place better than she knew her own apartment. 13 years of Wednesday mornings sometimes, Saturday afternoons mostly, always when the light came sideways and did not show too much detail. The rain made it worse. The rain made everything visible at the same time it obscured everything, the way bad weather does. Danielle Ross, Captain, United States Navy, retired. Killed in action, 2011, Kandahar Province. Remembered by his wife, remembered by his son, remembered by the woman who knelt at his headstone with rain plastering her hair to her face and her hands shaking in a way they had not shaken when she was saving someone else's life. I couldn't save him, Dan, she said. The words were so quiet the rain nearly drowned them. "I tried, but I failed you again." The rain hammered the grass around her. It ran off the marble in streams that looked like tears but were only weather. She did not cry. Her eyes burned, but soldiers did not cry. They had rules about that, rules that had been written before she was born and had survived intact through 3 continents and 2 decades. She held the boots in her lap like an offering, like an apology, like the only thing she had left to give to a man who had already given everything and left her standing in the rain with less of a life than when he had died. Her phone sat in her pocket. No messages. No calls. No one was looking for her except the people looking to charge her with crimes that had never happened. She was unraveling. The mission, the quiet mission of being nobody, of nursing people back to health without letting them see the hands that were doing it, of rebuilding a life into something smaller and quieter and less dangerous, had collapsed completely. She sat there for 11 minutes, just kneeling in the rain. And then she heard it. A sound that did not belong in a cemetery. A sound that came from the distance at first, then closer, a steady bass thump that moved through the air like something alive. A helicopter. Not the emergency kind that brought patients to hospitals. The military kind. The kind with speed and intention. It was distant still, but it was coming closer, and somewhere in the part of her that was still a senior chief petty officer and not just a woman kneeling in the rain, Danielle understood that nothing would ever be small or quiet again. The helicopter sound grew louder, and Danielle understood with absolute clarity that her life had just split into before and after. She stood from the grave, rain-soaked, hands trembling not from cold but from the weight of what was coming. 23 years of running. 23 years of being no one. And it was ending tonight. The rotor wash shook the parking lot trees as the Black Hawk descended toward Oak Creek Memorial's helipad, its lights cutting through the San Diego darkness like searchlights. She drove straight back to the hospital, still in her civilian clothes, still carrying the weight of her husband's name on her lips. The military convoy was already there when she arrived, for vehicles lined up at the main entrance, personnel in dress uniforms moving with the precise choreography of people operating under combat rules of engagement. One of them saw her, made eye contact, and nodded once. They had been waiting for her. The doors burst open and boots hit the tile floor, that specific sound, leather on linoleum, the rhythm of a formation moving with absolute purpose. The lead officer was a captain, jaw like weathered stone, the kind of face that had made hard decisions at 0300 hours and slept fine afterward. Behind him came enlisted personnel, their dress blues pressed sharp enough to cut, and at the rear, moving with the controlled stride of someone trained to enter hostile territory, was a young man in navy dress uniform. Her son. Same jaw. Same eyes. Same way of holding his shoulders like he carried the weight of people who counted on him. The captain approached the hospital administrator's office without asking permission. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Nurses stepped aside. Orderlies pressed themselves against walls. The air in the corridor had changed, the kind of pressure shift that happens when apex predators enter a room, and every animal in that space recognizes it and goes quiet. Dr. Hargrove was still in the building. Of course he was. It was 2,206 hours and he was reviewing charts in his office when the captain's fist came down on his desk like a gavel. Hospital administration scrambled. The chief of staff appeared. Security was nowhere because they already understood that no one was leaving this meeting unauthorized. "Where is Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross?" the captain asked. His voice carried the kind of authority that came from commanding men in places where mistakes cost lives. Dr. Hargrove's face went white. White like someone had just pulled a ripcord on his entire reality. "I don't know who." "Get her. Now." Danielle was already there. She had followed the sound of boots and now stood in the doorway, and when her son saw her, something broke open in his face. He stepped forward and for the first time in 3 months, the mask came off completely. There was no more quiet nurse. There was no more hiding. "Mom." His voice cracked. "They told me my CO is alive because Senior Chief Ross defied orders." The room went absolutely still. You could hear the fluorescent lights, the hum of machinery, the rain against the windows. Danielle didn't speak. Didn't need to. The captain stepped forward with a file folder, its edges worn, section stamped classified. He opened it with methodical precision and began to read. Bronze Star with Valor. First deployment, Anbar Province, 2009. He looked at the assembled staff. He looked at Hargrove. Then back at the file. Bronze Star with Valor. Second deployment, Helm and Province, 2011. Another pause. Each decoration getting heavier. Bronze Star with Valor. Third deployment, Ramadi District, 2013. The hospital staff had stopped pretending to work. They were staring. Nurses. Doctors. Administrative staff. All of them seeing this quiet woman they had dismissed, watching her transform in real time. Bronze Star with Valor, fourth time. Kandahar Province, 2014. The captain's voice never wavered. He was reading an official record now, and in this moment, the official record was the only truth that mattered. Silver Star. Direct Action, Ramadi, 2015. Entire platoon extraction under fire. He looked up from the file. His eyes found hers, and there was respect there, the kind of respect that only flows between people who have operated in the space where the margin between survival and death is measured in seconds. Silver Star. Direct Action, Classified Operation, same theater, same year. The one nobody talks about. The one that saved people who don't officially exist. He closed the file. Handed it to the SEAL team leader standing to his left, a senior chief himself with a presence like a storm front moving across open water. The team leader stepped forward, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of men who had bled together, trained together, survived impossible things together. The decorations belong to the best medic this Navy has ever produced, he said quietly. She was supposed to rotate stateside for years ago. She never did. She kept extending, kept going, kept saving people who the rest of us thought were already gone. He paused. Until the day she couldn't save one more thing. Danielle's jaw tightened. A full second passed. The team leader continued. She walked away. Didn't file for benefits. Didn't take a consulting contract. Didn't write a book or do a podcast. She became a nurse in a civilian hospital and saved people quietly because that's who she is. And your doctor, he turned to Hargrove, your doctor just fired her for following the same instinct that kept 347 Marines alive over 2 decades. 347. The number hung in the air like a charge. Hargrove's face had gone from white to grey, and now it was the color of something dying. He tried to speak. Nothing came out. His mouth worked like he was drowning in air. The security guard who had handed Danielle her box of personal belongings 8 hours earlier appeared at Hargrove's shoulder. In his hands was an identical cardboard box. He set it down on the doctor's desk with a soft thud that somehow sounded louder than the helicopter outside. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor," the security guard said. What happened next took exactly 3 minutes. Federal agents arrived, Department of Defense investigators who had been waiting in a conference room the entire time, cross-referencing Hargrove's billing records against equipment actually received, comparing purchase orders against equipment logs, tracking 7 years of phantom charges and inflated invoices that had been systematically buried in the ICU records. Equipment that was never purchased. Supplies that were never delivered. Kickback arrangements with 3 different medical device companies that added up to $847,000. Every fraudulent claim. Every kickback. Every inflated invoice. All of it documented. All of it federal. All of it the kind of thing that triggered not just medical license revocation but criminal indictment. Hargrove tried to run. Actually stood up and moved toward the door. The federal agent who had been quietly standing in the corner just moved slightly to block his path, and Hargrove stopped cold because he finally understood that he wasn't in control of anything anymore. He was surrounded by people who made their living in exactly these situations. 6 months later, Danielle was back in the ICU. The hospital had fired Hargrove immediately. Had initiated a full internal review. Had brought in an ethics committee. The Navy had opened a separate investigation into the decision to abandon a salvageable patient, and that investigation had led to exactly 0 disciplinary actions because the record showed conclusively that a single nurse had saved a life that 12 physicians had deemed already lost. The hospital offered her the position of Director of Trauma Services. Offered it in writing. Offered it with a salary that made her eyes widen slightly, though she gave nothing away. She declined in writing. Went back to the ICU. Back to 12-hour shifts. Back to scrubs and gloves and the specific satisfaction of hands-on patient care. Lieutenant Commander Pierce was recovering in Bay 4. Still had a way to go. A pneumothorax had nicked his left lung, but the lung was repairing itself, tissue by tissue, breath by breath. And at the foot of his bed, placed with military precision, sat a pair of boots. Combat boots. Desert tan. The soles were worn through in places. The laces were frayed. Sand was still visible in the treads. Pierce's team had carried those boots out of Baghdad. Had carried them through 3 deployments. Had brought them to his bedside as a reminder of every kilometer they had walked together, every firefight they had survived, every brother they had lost. The same boots that Danielle had cut off his feet that night, when she refused to let him die, when she did the math in her head, 2 broken legs versus a man who could still breathe if she got the pressure off his chest, and chose to save the savable. She checked his vitals at 1,438 hours. O2 sat 94% and climbing steady. Heart rate 68, regular. Blood pressure 120/80. The kind of numbers that meant a man was going to walk again. "How's the pain?" she asked, setting the pulse oximeter aside. "Gone," he said. Which is weird because I remember it being loud. She almost smiled. Pain is data. It tells you where the damage is. Once the damage starts healing, the data gets quieter. He looked at those boots. "My team won't leave without them. They're bringing me out like we came in. As a unit." "Then you'd better get stronger faster," she said. "Because those boots are waiting for their owner." She turned to leave. He called her back. "My CO told me," Pierce said. "About who you are. About what you did. About the 12 doctors who walked away." She paused in the doorway. "I would have been dead if you'd listened to them," he said. "I would have been dead if you'd followed the hierarchy instead of your training. I would have been dead, and my team would be carrying an empty pair of boots." She didn't respond. Didn't need to. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the weight of 23 years coming down on a moment where she had finally allowed herself to be seen. 3 weeks later, Danielle was in the parking lot after her shift when her son was waiting by her car. He didn't say anything at first. Just stood there in civvies now, having taken leave from his post, the Navy Cross ceremony next week where his mother would receive recognition she had never sought. He held out a fresh cup of coffee from the place across the street. She took it. Neither of them spoke. They sat on the hood of her car and watched the San Diego sunset spread across the sky like intelligence officers reading maps, and that was enough. The trembling was gone now. Replaced by something else. Something that looked like peace. Scars tell stories. Hers just happened to be the kind that save lives. If you've ever faced a choice between following orders and following your conscience, hit like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, would you have done what Danielle did? Would you have saved a life the system told you to abandon?